In the mid-2000s, something strange was happening in America. People who could barely afford rent were suddenly buying houses. Banks were celebrating, and Wall Street acted like nothing could go wrong. They were all wrong. Back then, everyone believed the same simple idea. Housing prices only go up. Banks were lending fast, families were buying fast, and investors were pouring billions into anything connected to real estate. But beneath all that confidence, something dangerous was building. Home prices were rising fast and everyone felt like they were winning. Buying a house suddenly seemed easy, maybe a little too easy. While families celebrated their new homes, Wall Street analysts began to notice something strange. The numbers weren't adding up. Banks started pushing subprime loans to anyone who walked in. Families thought they were getting a great deal, but the risks were quietly stacking up. Banks took thousands of risky loans and repackaged them into CDOs. On paper, they looked safe, but everyone involved knew they were anything but. Ratings agencies stamped these risky CDOs with AA ratings, the safest score possible. Everyone pretended everything was fine, even when it clearly wasn't. When housing prices stopped climbing, the cracks appeared fast. Homeowners panicked, and Wall Street suddenly realized the boom was over. When families couldn't keep up with rising payments, foreclosures spread everywhere. Entire neighborhoods were suddenly filled with homes no one could afford. As foreclosures exploded, panic hit Wall Street. Banks were drowning in bad debt, and the system everyone trusted began collapsing in real time. When Lehman Brothers fell, the panic became global. Investors ran, banks froze, and the entire system shook like it was about to fall apart. As the crisis deepened, real wages fell and millions lost their jobs. Families who had nothing to do with Wall Street were suddenly facing bankruptcy. With the system collapsing, the Treasury begged for a massive bailout. But convincing the government wasn't easy. Nobody wanted to rescue the same banks that caused the mess. In the end, the bailout was approved. The Treasury signed with hesitation, but officials believed it was the only way to stop a total collapse. When taxpayers heard about the bailout, fury erupted. People asked why ordinary families were left struggling while the banks were rescued. When AIG collapsed, the crisis hit a new level. The company had insured billions in toxic loans, and now it couldn't pay any of them back. When money market funds broke the buck, even the safest investments suddenly looked dangerous. For the first time, everyday savers felt the crisis hit home. As American markets collapsed, the shock spread worldwide. Europe, Asia, and developing economies all felt the hit, turning a U.S. crisis into a global meltdown. As fear spread, banks stopped lending entirely. Even small businesses with good histories couldn't get a loan. The whole system had frozen. As businesses shut down, unemployment exploded. Lines at job centers wrapped around the block, and millions were suddenly out of work. To stop a total collapse, the government launched a $700 billion rescue plan called TARP. It was risky, controversial, but officials believed it was the last line of defense. Even America's biggest automakers were on the brink. GM, Ford, and Chrysler all begged Congress for help as sales collapsed to historic lows. When homeowners couldn't make their payments anymore, the situation turned grim. Thousands of families began losing their homes. Banks didn't wait. They auctioned off the houses to recover whatever money they could. As the crisis deepened, the human cost became impossible to ignore. Families were losing homes, jobs disappeared overnight, and food banks were overwhelmed. For millions, the collapse wasn't just economic, it was personal. Even as millions lost their jobs and homes, top bank executives continued taking massive bonuses. To the public, it felt like a betrayal. The people who helped cause the crisis were still getting rewarded while everyone else suffered. As the crisis spread across the world, global leaders rushed into an emergency G20 summit. Every country was hurting, and they knew the collapse could get even worse if they didn't act fast. As the crisis spiraled, central banks around the world slashed interest rates to almost zero. The Federal Reserve made emergency cuts, hoping cheaper borrowing would stop the economy from collapsing even further. To keep the economy alive, the government launched a massive stimulus package. Millions of Americans received relief checks, lifelines for some, barely enough for others, as uncertainty continued to spread. By March 2009, the stock market hit rock bottom. Trillions of dollars in wealth had vanished, retirement accounts were destroyed, and investors watched in disbelief as the crash reached its lowest point. Slowly, the economy began to stabilize. Home construction picked up, small businesses reopened, and families finally started to feel a bit of hope again. It wasn't a full recovery yet, but the worst was finally behind. The 2008 crisis reshaped the world. It exposed deep flaws in the system, showed how fast things can collapse, and taught hard lessons about risk and responsibility. And even today, its impact is still felt,